Hey, thank you everybody for being here. Thanks for letting me come back up on stage. This time I'm here just to introduce my esteemed colleagues, Mary Beth here, David Weber and Stephen Wine. They're going to be talking about measuring disengagement, how we assess disengagement in individuals. So I will hand it over to Mary Beth, and we also understand that we are standing between you and happy hour, so we will not go over time, promise.
Thank you, Sarah. So it's truly been a pleasure to be here today. I learned so much from all the other presentations. Today we'll be talking about assessing disengagement. Okay. So I wanted to begin by just distinguishing between disengagement and resistance. So disengagement, as many of you know, is the process of ceasing one's involvement in terrorist behavior. And so that behavior can include anything from supporting or facilitating a violent extremist or a terrorist group online, to fundraising, to intelligence collection, to direct violent action. Resistance, on the other hand, is a decline and eventual cessation of offending. And so I bring up this distinction because a lot of times we're talking about these processes in the penal process, and we may have individuals, particularly when it comes to domestic terrorism, who are not on law enforcement's radar or who have not committed a criminal offense. So I think it's really important to distinguish these two processes because we may have individuals who are persisting, that's the decline in their criminal activity, but they're not necessarily disengaging from violent extremism. And both of these processes, research shows, are dynamic, they're non-linear, and they're not marked by a single event. So I guess my first news is bad news. That means that they're very difficult to measure, right? Because just because someone's disengaged or persisted today, as it seems, doesn't mean that they won't go back to that behavior down the line. So when I first started studying this, I consulted a lot of different literature, and you can see all the literature behind me. But the one model that I found incredibly useful, I got it. The one model that I found incredibly useful came from social psychology, and that's Carol Russell's investment model. And that model posits that one's commitment to any social role, so this could be your violent extremist role, this could be your new pro-social role in society, is a function of three factors. So that's the satisfaction you get from that role, the investments you've made in that role. So when we're talking about violent extremists, those investments are some cost, so things like tattoos, foregoing in education, those sorts of things. And the alternatives available to you. Now, this model is useful for a number of reasons, I think. The first is that it has a very robust empirical evidence base. So there is a lot of support for this model across a range of different social roles. So commitment to your job, to your spouse, to the decision to go to war, all different things. So we do have a very robust empirical evidence base for it. Second, it allows us to look at commitment and to try and understand where individuals are at. So, are they deeply dissatisfied with their involvement, but they lack alternatives? Is that what's driving their commitment to violent extremism? Or are they really satisfied with their involvement? Are they getting something out of it? It also allows us to map these changes over time. So individuals may be, deeply satisfied at one point in time and not another. And it also, just by using that satisfaction component, allows us to account for differences across individuals in what's driving satisfaction. So for some individuals, that may be driven by social bonds. For others, it may be driven by the sense of adventure. Certain violent extremists have a penchant for violence. That may be the satisfaction that they're getting, and others feel like they're fulfilling that ideology. So it really captures that nuance across individuals and for individuals over time. So in terms of what explains disengagements, one of the other things I look at when assessing disengagement is not just what's driving commitments and how committed individuals are, but are they experiencing any of the common push-pull factors for disengagement? And so I know this audience is probably familiar with push and pull factors. So push factors are things about your involvement that push you away from your violent extremist role, and pull factors are things outside that lure you to a more conventional social role. And the reason that I would assess this for individuals is that research that I've done with my colleagues shows that individuals' disengagement decisions are more commonly driven by push factors. So when and I'm happy to talk about the data in the Q&A, but when we look at these things, what we're finding is that push factors more commonly drive disengagement decisions. And this is actually very consistent with Russell's work, where they find that satisfaction component is more important than the alternative component. That said, we also find in our research that pull factors, I can switch this here, that pull factors are important, and they're important for a subset of violent extremists. So they're important for violent extremists who are not ideologically committed. So I would ask what push-pull factors are individuals experiencing, as well as what is their level of ideological commitment. Because if they are not ideologically committed, those pull factors can play a potentially very important role in helping them disengage and remain disengaged. Finally, I would ask what roles did they hold while they were involved? So some of the research that I've done with my colleagues shows that individuals in certain roles are more likely to experience different push-pull factors, and that individuals in certain roles, particularly leadership or violent roles, are more likely to have certain sunk costs and fewer alternatives available to them. And this is even when controlling for the level of ideological commitment. We find leaders and violent actors have perceived barriers to disengagement that other individuals just don't have. So they may need additional support services or some help in seeing a way outside of their extremist role. Finally, what I would ask also is how likely are these individuals to re-engage? So just because someone is disengaged today, that doesn't mean that they won't re-engage tomorrow. And so research that I've done, you can see up here, looks at the drivers of re-engagement. And what we find in our data is that re-engagement in violent extremism declines specifically with age. This is very similar to the criminal context. We also find that individuals who come from a lower childhood socioeconomic status are much more likely to re-engage. And I think this has to do with the alternatives available to them outside of violent extremism. We also find that commitments to ideology and ties to individuals still involved in violent extremism are two of the most robust predictors of re-engagement in violent extremism. And I have this up here in yellow because those are the things that are amenable to intervention. So you can't change someone's age, you can't change their childhood socioeconomic status. So those are what we call in the criminal literature static risk factors. But these other two are dynamic risk factors and things that are amenable to intervention. In our data, we also find when we throw all these things in a statistical model, that one's employment or parental or marital status are not robust predictors or statistically significant predictors of re-engagement in violent extremism. And this is very different than the criminal context. And I think this has come up earlier today. And the reason that we think this is different is that in the short term, these things don't matter if individuals are ideologically committed, which is what we're controlling for in our model. So if you have a job, but you're still deeply committed to the cause, you may go and engage in violent extremism, even though you do have a job and some so this isn't to say that employment and marriage, depending on who you're married to, and parental status don't matter. They do, they absolutely matter in the long term, because over time, these are the pro-social ties that will change your ideological commitment and that will change your networks. So they are absolutely important in the long term to establish, but in the short term, they don't actually shape re-engagement behavior. The last thing I want to highlight is that de-radicalization is often a lengthy process. So when I think about assessing disengagement, I think it's actually much more helpful to assess, what protective factors are in place for individuals. Do they have, a pathway to those pro-social ties? What are they reintegrating into? So this hasn't actually come up today, but what are the milieus that they're reintegrating into in society? And, particularly as we're seeing the radicalization of certain sectors of America, I would ask, what communities are they going back to, and are they going to be able to establish those pro-social ties? And then over time, I would start to ask, how well reintegrated are they? Are they developing a healthy identity? Some of the things I think Sarah mentioned on the earlier panel. So I think in some ways that's a much more useful way for assessing disengagement, sort of flipping on its head and say, well, how well are they reintegrating? Because those things will serve as protective factors and prevent re-engagement. So I think I'll wrap up there. Yep, that's it. Thank you.
David Weber, we're getting inside now. These are extra slides. No, there we go.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here to speak with you all. A lot of my work over the last decade almost now in this de-radicalization, radicalization space and program evaluation assessment has really been international. So for me, it's been really interesting to hear about the work that is now being done domestically, because my expertise has been looking at it. We know countries in the Netherlands, I've been in Mali, the Philippines, and Sri Lanka. I'm going to talk a little bit about here as well. I'm a social psychologist. That's how I approach understanding radicalization. And when I want to talk about disengagement from you is, we understand what drives people toward radicalization. We can help to use that to understand what we can do to help disengage them. But then it also helps me identify, like, what would I want to look for then to assess if a program is actually effective at disengaging people. So this led me, I'm going to talk a little bit about theory. I know we're excited about that this late, but that's where I decided to take this when I put this together. So I'm going to talk about the model that my colleagues and I have used in our research. We call that the 3N model. It identifies 3 different factors that we think are important in facilitating movement toward extremism. The first of these N's is the need or the psychological motivation. Our research argues that extremism is really the result of a motivational imbalance. It's this idea that one value, one need has become so dominant in one person's concern that they're willing to do whatever it takes to fulfill it, no matter what it means for other things that we normally value. And our research has consistently found that a common need that is active among violent extremists and terrorists is the need to feel significant. Okay? And that's the need to feel like you're important, to feel like you matter, to feel like you're respected in some way. I've heard this kind of brought up multiple times throughout the day in different words and different phrases, where we're talking about many of the same things. Now, when that need becomes dominant, what you do as an individual is you look to your surroundings to identify, what could I do to get out of this place? What could I do to feel like I matter and feel like I'm important? And when you do that, you look to your social networks, okay? Our social networks identify for us what are those narratives out there that tell us do X, Y, and Z, and that'll make you feel important, make you feel valued again, okay? Our networks also tell us that if other people around me believe this, follow this ideology, that it's also right for me as well, right? So it's the same reason we insert the laugh track underneath the sitcom, or the same reason we see the tip jar when we go to a local coffee shop. I'm more likely to laugh at a sitcom when other people are laughing. I'll find it more funny. I'm also more likely to think the service is better if other people tell me that it's better, right? If I'm surrounded by other people that tell me this ideology is right and fighting and using violence on behalf of this ideology is right, I'm more likely to do it right for myself, right? So we look to this network component. And then we look at this narrative component, the final end in the model. Violence is something that we know is not normally allowed, right? So you need to attach yourself to some type of ideology that tells you under certain circumstances, violence is appropriate and violence is acceptable. And more than that, it tells you doing this will bring you significance. So do these things, fight for your group, fight for this cause, you'll earn praise, you'll be rewarded, you'll earn a sense of significance. We put these 3 factors together, the need, the narrative, and the network, we find that extremism is often driven by people, again, striving to feel significant. They find a narrative that tells them how to do that. In this case, we're talking about violence, enforcing negative narrative, political violence. And that narrative is introduced to them in their network, but it's then kind of reciprocated the validity of that within their network as well. Okay. Now that's how we can get there, but we can also use these same factors to understand how we can pull people out. Right. So the significance need is really important. How can I disengage people? Like then try to address their deficit in significance. I can do things like counseling to address self-esteem, depression, issues that might be driving them there. If they no longer have those as a concern, they no longer need to find them. Right? I can present them with alternative ways to do something. The extremist group, the extremist movement isn't the only way to get those feelings. You can get them from many other socially acceptable ways. Maybe I just need to give you some skills training. We talked about before, some vocational training, letting you know that there are other options out there for you that can help pull you out, that can help provide you with significance. On the narrative side, we often see there's some kind of dialogue that's engaged in. Whether or not that is a useful task is the question. but trying to dissuade people about their ideological beliefs. And then on the network side, something's been talked about, Mary Beth talked about this as well, this idea that we want to kind of break up the contact you have with your former students and current students, right? I can either try to break your ties with the bad influences, or I can try to build positive influences and other network ties that can help you in a positive way. This might be like using mentors, using formers, introducing people to members of the community that is successful, that they can see a way out, see a way forward. Okay? Now that's why I use it for disengagement, but if I want to test if disengagement is effective, I would want to look, am I working on these factors as well, right? So I would then look on the significance side, I could measure things like the need for significance. And let me take a step back. If I was doing this as a program, we often have like an intake interview session. This would be a place where I could start to measure some of these things alongside what I would normally do in an intake process. And then I could measure it after a period of time, hoping that over time there's been some reduction in these various factors, right? So on the need for significance, I can measure, there's very clear to do this. The extent to which people feel important, the extent to which they feel their life has significance. I can measure whether they feel their life has meaning, if they're actively searching for meaning. I can look at if they've endorsed or they find other places to get meaning outside of an experience group. On the network side, I want to look at their identity. And this was brought up, I think, multiple times earlier as well. But one way I want to look at this is the extent to which their personal identity is based in that identity of the group, right? If I can show that they're breaking away from that group identity and forming a multifaceted identity that's not just tied up in that, that's good. I can also look at tangible ties to former extremists and other individuals, sense of isolation. Okay. And then on the narrative side, endorsement of a violent ideology. And I'm really interested in hearing things that might drive people for violence, right? So the kind of delegitimization or the dehumanization that we often do to allow us to engage in violence against other people. The dichotomous thinking, the us versus them, the black versus white, the right versus wrong type of thinking that we know through research lead people to believe in conspiracy theories, leads to higher levels of political extremism, right? If I can measure that there's a reduction in these things, I can hopefully assess some level of disengagement or radicalization. I wanted to quickly give you an example of a way my team and I have done this. We did this in Sri Lanka with the former members of the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Lam. We didn't have them at intake, but we measured these various factors at 3 different time points once, and then 6 months later, and then a year later. Over time, we found that there was a significant reduction in their endorsement of violent extremism. We also interestingly had a kind of naturally occurring comparison group here, where just by nature of the facilities people went to, they didn't receive the full treatment. They just received kind of basic things like family visitation. They allowed them to do like religious services. We then were allowed to compare to those people and say the people who received the real treatment, things that should impact on your significance motive, the things like counseling, the things like vocational training, the things like an education training. These should be the things that really have an impact, and that's where you see we see a much more significant, pronounced reduction in extremism over time among these individuals. Right. Now you might also say like, hopefully you're also providing aftercare if you can in some of your programs as well. So you could try to follow up with people afterwards to see is there a kind of a long-lasting effect here. And we were able to do that in Sri Lanka as well. We were able to follow up with about 200 of these individuals after they graduated the rehabilitation program. We participation in treatment here was voluntary, right? So although those programs were there, they had to opt into that. So we asked people, how many programs did you participate in? Greater participation meant greater exposure to treatment, which should have greater impact on their lives, and our results show that it did. The greater they participated in treatment, the less they were requesting for significance, which then reduced their endorsement of extremism, which we measured in 3 different ways that you can see on the screen. As endorsement of violence and extremism, often they're kind of longing for the good old days when they were an extremist, and also their willingness to express positivity towards their opposition in the conflict, which was the government and the ethnic majority in Sri Lanka. So that's just kind of a taste of a way that I would approach disengagement from this theoretical perspective that's based in social psychology. I'm just going to thank you. My contact information is up there. You can't read any of this, but these are my colleagues and some of the research. I work with really, really great people, and I just wanted to put their names up on the screen because I owe my career to many of these people as well. And on that note, I will end it and pass it along.
All right, and now Steve Wine.
Is that you?
No.
No.
You didn't find it to our code of your own. Needle pink. We'll find it.
Okay, thanks. So I work with a great team too, at UIC and Boston Children's, including Heidi Ellis. And some of the work that I'm going to be talking about today is funded by DHF Science and Technology and State Department. So I want to speak to you all, this network of practitioners and policymakers and donors who support this work, and walk you through some thinking and a few actions regarding the issue of evaluation and outcomes for disengagement. And I'm going to advocate for a person-centered approach to thinking about assessing disengagement. First question is why outcomes? I don't know if we need to really get into that in detail, but why outcomes? Because I think this is our chance right now. I mean, the money is flowing, projects are growing, are the evaluations happening? And do we have good metrics to do those evaluations? If we don't get this right this time, when are we going to get it right? And are we going to get another chance? Is the concern that I have. So the next question is which outcomes should we be looking at? And we've heard some good ideas already. I love the roadmap that Jordan and his team gave for us for thinking about this at the state level. That has been super helpful. There are a lot of different potential indicators of individual, family, and programmatic levels. There are plenty of existing measures out there. Does the world need new measures to answer this problem? We came to the conclusion that it probably does. And we developed a new kind of measure in this space. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Did you find it?
I
I
did.
can do it without it. Doesn't really.
You can start without it and then I will.
Okay. So, what's the approach that guided us? The approach first thing was person-centered. What does person-centered mean? That means thinking about disengagement through the eyes and perspective of the persons going through disengagement. How did they see it? What matters to them? What terms do they and constructs do they use? How would they rate themselves? The other is collaborative. Seeing it as a collaborative endeavor between that person and the practitioners that are working with them. Another is evidence-based, so being rooted in whatever existing evidence exists, which could be from our field, such as the research you all shared, or from adjacent fields. The other idea is that it be accessible and affordable, not behind a paywall. The other idea is that it be theoretically grounded in sound theory in our field. So, okay, yeah, we're going to just look at some of the slides in my. Was that it? Okay, great. How to develop it? Well, through a couple steps, which some of you all have named already. One is to engage in a systematic literature review, which we did. Another is to hold workshops with practitioners and with formers, and then to directly engage them in the development of the instrument. So it so happened that we were given a chance to do this in Central Asia. So that's where we started, working with returnees in Central Asia. And so we developed an instrument, and I'll show you a little bit of what it looks like. Well, first thing, from what we did is through this systematic literature review, we looked and we established all of these different kinds of constructs, those are the rows, that that were being measured in other kinds of work and that we thought deserved to be considered in this space. for example, work and financial independence, or involvement in ideology or family support, self-esteem and identity. Many of the ideas have been kicked around already here. But we organized it in a different way, and our theory of change, which Heidi and I and our team have developed, is not 3M, but 5R. It's the model formerly known as R&R. 5R, which in an international context where you have people coming from abroad, it makes sense to call it repatriation, resettlement, reintegration, rehabilitation, resilience. I'll later talk about it in an adaptation in the domestic context, which becomes 4R. So what we thought about is in each of these different realms, which I'm not going to really explain, what are the indicators that, how do those indicators that I showed before sort out into these different realms? And it sorts out like this. Some indicators are specific to one of those realms and some cut across several of those realms. And then working with the stakeholders, persons who are involved in this, we came up with constructs and questions or statements. It's not, there we go. So these are statements that are made in an affirmative way, like that a person would say about themselves or their child. I have legal status as a citizen in all necessary days, for example, or any emotional problems I have, like depression, anxiety, fear, don't interfere with living the life I want. I feel safe and accepted in the community where I live. These kind of statements. And then a person is asked to say, to endorse their level of disagreement or agreement with these things. And there are 18 such items that cover all of those constructs. And so this got workshopped and piloted and then has since been implemented basically twice with a couple hundred people in Kazakhstan and in another Central Asian country. And we're analyzing the data now, and it's going to be coming out relatively soon. But I'll just show you some ways in which we think that this could be helpful. And by the way, we also asked people to indicate which of these items they think was the most important in determining the quality of their life. So, some data, you can see that some of these areas are rated relative. This is just like simple means for these items. Some of these items are rated a little bit lower than others, like basic needs are met, or health problems or emotional problems. And we found that these really aligned with things we heard from focus groups that, for example, a program might do a better job addressing theological and ideological issues than helping people with housing and access to services. And that's what they really want and need. So we find it could be, we found it to be, let's say, reflective of what we heard people saying and helpful in that sense. Another, you see here the ranking of prioritization of like what are the most important things. And I think it's interesting also to check out the alignment or misalignment between what practitioners and beneficiaries and policymakers think are the most important. And again, the things that we hear the beneficiaries say skew towards very practical, daily kind of quality of life experiences. Sorry. So We think that that's helpful direction to head in. We have, we're trying to establish psychometric properties of this. We have good alpha coefficient scores. But more work has to be done, a lot more work. We have to do test, retest, evaluations, things like that, and adapt it and test it in different contexts. And so the next challenge is to do this in a domestic context. So we're working with Sarah, like After 8. We're working with 2 entities in Canada, and maybe others, to adapt this for a domestic context. For those who are involved in either secondary or tertiary prevention, who are either voluntary or mandated, and who have either come from abroad in a minority of cases, or in most cases are domestic. And we're trying to come up with one tool that can address all of these situations and is person-centered in the way that I mentioned. And some interesting issues have come out in discussion so far. The question is, are these groups different in such a way that would cause us to have to either have a new tool or some kind of caveat for a certain kind of items? We're not sure. We don't have answers to that. I think one of the interesting issues comes up around something that was mentioned a few minutes ago about social relationships with people within the movement or outside of the movement. You could have excellent social relationships with extremists, but that's not really what we're aiming for in terms of disengagement. So how do you ask those questions in the best way? So these are the kinds of things that we're struggling with. You'll notice if you look at the instrument, it doesn't look very, let's say, violence or ideology focused. Most of the items are really more about other kinds of social, family, and psychosocial community variables. We think that's how it should be. And the analogy that I make, and one of the places that we, take this from, is the difference between so-called recovery models of mental illness and clinical models of mental illness. If you've ever looked at, if you're familiar with the recovery movement, where there's a whole set of issues that reflect more the lived experience of people than they do like clinical constructs, psychopathology or whatnot. So I think that's really what we're going for, and we'll see whether or not it proves its worth in terms of the use in the field. We want this to be something that doesn't disrupt the conversation, the relationship between the practitioner and the client, but is a facilitator of that. We think it's good for them to be talking about these kinds of indicators together in a language that the client is comfortable with. But we'll see whether or not that actually bears out, and then we'll see whether or not it ultimately has the psychometric properties that we need to be successful. I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, all of you, for being here. And I do want to allow for questions in the audience. I guess the first question that I would start with is, we have now looked at tools and measures, ways of assessing disengagement that involve serving the individual directly. What are some of the issues you see, and what are some ways that individuals, that programs or providers can mitigate the challenges of assessing an individual who's actively engaged, who may be obscuring their involvement or may not be fully disclosing their status in their engagement? How might we use these tools, or do we have tools to assess their level of engagement and then later disengagement when they're not really willing to talk to us?
I'll take a stab at that. I would say, right, in a lot of the research we've done, we focused on self-report measures. Fortunately, our research has, for the most part, found that we're not getting like a floor effect on the variables that we're measuring. So they might be down adjusting their responses in some way, but they're not adjusting to the where everybody's just not admitting, right? And so fortunately, we found that the only case we didn't find that was with Syrian refugees in Germany, but this is a group we didn't expect to see violence on among as well. So if you also add in kind of the measurement of time as well, so if you understand that you're looking at change across time as opposed to your raw mean levels, then you can get rid of some of that as well. I would also say self-report works for me, but I don't think it's gonna work for everybody as well. There's benefits to doing things like a clinical interview and involving discussions in these other ways where you use your expertise, observation to look at these as well. It's what I use, but it's by no means the only way to do it.
Yeah, so I guess what I would say is it would depend on, I guess, where the person is. So if they are, under supervision, for instance, I think a multi-agency team would be very important. So you need to balance that reintegration with the security risks. I think it becomes much more difficult, as you probably know, if you have individuals, who maybe aren't under surveillance or you can't put restrictions on them. So there, I think the challenge becomes much more difficult to assess.
So self-report is a huge problem, and a huge limitation, and it's true in like all areas of mental health and behavioral health. And there are only two ways that I know around that, which may or may not be so practical, is there's a drive in the mental health field embodied in the National Institute of Mental Health RDoC research domain criteria strategy, which is to rely on tests which measure essentially brain circuit functions, such as something simple like the go, no-go test, if you know what that is. And it could be, for example, that someday we'll have good tests on something like cognitive flexibility or some other brain circuit proxy indicators that we think might be important part of this process, but we're certainly not going to get at all of the process, all of the psychosocial domains. But so if we have things like that, I think that's one not bad way to go. And the other thing is alignment between different stakeholders. So between the alignment or lack of alignment between practitioners and the person, the beneficiary, or family members, or security agents, or whatnot. And I think that could be very important and more immediately feasible way of approaching this issue.
And when you start talking about supervision, that made me think that issues with self-report tend to be a bigger issue if there's some kind of tangible reward for the people that demonstrate that, yes, I'm showing no, like, yes, I'm not extreme anymore, and they get a reward for that. So if you can make sure that there's no benefit tied to participation in these, and that's clear up front to the participants, you should avoid any bias in that direction. That's what we've done in all of our work. When we work with detainees or prisoners, it's very clear to them that they will get no benefit in their time in prison by participating or being honest or lying. So they have there's nothing to lose by being honest with us.
Very cool question. Okay.
Hi, Tiara. I have a question. First of all, very interesting panel. Thank you very much. Learned quite a bit in a short period of time. Assessing disengagement, how different is it from assessing risk? Are they close to each other and can either be used as quote unquote diagnostic?
So by risk, you mean risk of re-engagement, of engagement in violence,
Risk
or
of engagement in violence, not being.
okay.
Can disengagement scales, can assessment of disengagement be used as a tool to assess risk of engagement? Not re-engagement, but risk of engagement, in threat assessment.
Risk of engagement in violence.
In violence.
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely, because and they're kind of the opposite of each other, right? So if I believe that, and again, here I would push you to maybe not use the word disengagement, but flip that. And so if I see someone, so I think of, actually it was in part of my presentation, but I took it out and then some time, but you know, if I think about people sometimes ask like, who's the person you like interviewed who seems most well adjusted and like really, you know, most disengaged? And as a guy who's an IRA bomber, he was in the middle of Ireland, does IT and doesn't talk about acts of terrorists, and it's very clear that he's remarried, that's why he's here in the US, we could never get to see her because he's denied a visa. But so it's very clear to me that this fellow is at very low risk of violence, and he, you know, he still believes in United Ireland, but he, you know, I could talk more about this process, but he's someone that really disavows violence now, and it's not part of his identity, and I know this came up earlier, but sometimes when I see a performer, and it's such a big part of their identity, to me that's a little problematic, because I don't feel like they necessarily assume this is other healthy sense of self. It's not to say performers can't be doing this work, they absolutely can, but do they have some identity outside of this? And so I absolutely think that the more reintegrated someone is, the more of a healthy identity they have, those things, and there is research that shows those serve as protective factors for the individual, you know, particularly again, if they're not retaining those ties, if they're, you know, de-radicalizing. Here again, I mean de-radicalizing for belief in violence, right? It doesn't have to be that they've given up all their ideological beliefs, because again, like this fellow believes in United Ireland's hard work and it's that. So those beliefs aren't necessarily always problematic.
I'd say it's possible, but unlikely that we'll ever have the ends to statistically test that. And it's not as if the risk assessment measures have been well validated, because they have not, especially in the populations with which they're being used, like by the people in this room. I mean, that's just the state of our field. It's not, I'm not criticizing, it's just the state of our field. But I was going to say that this disengagement items strike me as being more like protective factors than risk factors. I would say the majority of our 18 items are protective factors, and you can have a lot of protective factors, but you can still be at risk and you can still flip. But I'd rather have those protective factors than not. So I'd say it's maybe a necessary but not sufficient to predict risk.
I'll just quickly add, I agree with everything that's been said already, but theoretically, the things that pose risk, kind of the absence of those things should lead to better disengagement, right? Ignoring the importance of these other factors that we also want to measure. So yeah, theoretically you could do that.
Hi, and thank you. Yeah, I'll reiterate, thank you for the information, very good. I think overall I agree, it's a good idea to be assessing these programs and being able to assess the success of disengagement in different programs. Is there any concern with, when you're assessing programs, with kind of incentivizing programs to over estimate their abilities? Is there any kind of negative influence of being able to assess the programs that you're concerned about?
Maybe not directly related, but I think that you know, I think we need to get comfortable with the fact that, you know, if a program is reducing risk across the board of re-engagement or recidivism, that program is successful, right? And so it might not mean that every individual who goes through the program does not re-engage in violent extremism or even commit a horrific attack, which we saw in London. And I think that's very hard for the public, it's very hard for security professionals. But when we look at the criminal context, you know, if they, where the recidivism rate is much higher, 45, 55, sometimes 60%, you know, if a program is reducing the general risk across the population, that program is successful. And I find in this state, we tolerate nothing less than a 0% re-engagement rate, and that doesn't mean that a program is a failure, again, if it is reducing that risk. And so I think it's very hard sometimes for these programs to, I would think it'd be very hard for them to inflate the work that they're doing, because there are these sort of standards that I think are a little bit unfair based upon them, so.
Maybe I'll just add to that. I understand the point, there's kind of a self-serving bias there, that, right, these programs need to demonstrate that they're working, so there's a motive there to inflate their success, to demonstrate giving more money, I should be around. One way to get around that would be to put the assessment in the hands of a third party who is not responsible for that. So that's kind of what we did in Sri Lanka when we went in there. We were not affiliated with the Sri Lankan government in any way. They had no say in what we did or how we did it, and it was a fully independent project there. So if you can find a way to get it assessed from a third party who doesn't have that incentive to mislead people with the data, you should be able to avoid that.
The other way that we approach that in the mental health field of research is we don't invest everything. Of course, people want successful programs, and they want good evaluations, but we don't invest everything in that. The other important issues are, can you engage people and recruit people to be in your program? That's another very important indicator. And then also, what are the mechanisms by which your intervention is working or not working? And so it may indeed work in a subgroup of your population very well, and not the whole population. So learning about that is advancing our field, even if your intervention, doesn't work at the mean level of your whole group. So there's ways to design evaluations that are advancing the field and advancing the science, even if it doesn't work. And so I think we have to incentivize programs to be able to contribute in that way also.
I just promised Neil the last question I was gonna ask. I'm just curious. I think so. At one level, I hear people asking about like how to establish efficacy, and then I hear sort of ideas about part of that is like what should be measured. And then like hearing like the comments about like can people game the system? Are there ways to do that? I think one of the other important questions is that now that funders, and this is not targeted, regardless if it's a government funder or a private funder, folks are asking for evaluations, but really from an accessibility standpoint, a lot of people who are getting funding to stand up programs don't know how to do evaluation and can't afford to have somebody come in and do evaluation for them. So I guess the question, like, how do you make evaluation accessible to the folks that can't afford that and don't know how to do it, don't have the training, professional capability? And then also the other side of the house as well, I think if we're being honest too, is that funders may be asking for evaluations. And again, this is across the spectrum. This is not an agency or organization, but they don't also necessarily understand like, what these effective metrics are for positive outcomes and sort of understanding what they should be even asking for or trying to assess as well. So how do you all have that conversation with folks that are asking you to do it? How do you make it more accessible? Like, I feel like those are some of the real issues that we like experience in this space on a regular basis.
To make it more accessible, you wait for his tool to be ready. And that's a big, hard question to answer. Fortunately, I've been able to, when I've been asked to be involved in assessment, it was with people who really valued it and could afford to do it. So I haven't had to deal with a lot of the difficulties that you have been describing. So I don't have a great answer to that question, unfortunately. Other than my terrible throat.
think that, we often live in such silos. And, you know, but CP3 is not like the first, entity to be, facing these issues. I mean, and, there is a wealth of great knowledge on how to evaluate public health oriented violence prevention programs. There's been hundreds of programs that the CDC has done to evaluate those. They have a whole division of injury prevention, DHS, F&G, Department of Education, SAMHSA, NIMH. They've done these things. So I think that one solution is more intergovernmental dialogue to build capacity, help build capacity in our little space here, leveraging off of good practices, because these issues have been faced and dealt with in you know, gender-based violence and sex trafficking and all kinds of other areas, and we can do it too, but we need help.
Yeah, but just to add, that I think at the time that a grant is awarded, that should be built in, perhaps by the funder to the grants, and to have this independent evaluation as David talked about. For two reasons: one, the money's there, but also a lot of times, like I know I've been asked to, like, can you come look at our program? Can you like help us with assessment? But the measures that I would need were not asked at the beginning. So I think if you build that in terms of the funding structure and having whoever's evaluating it there at the start of the program or whatever iteration of the program, you'll get much more meaningful evaluation measures than you would if that person wasn't there at the start of the program.
And I'll just also say, I'm not an academic, so I just want to caveat that, but the RAND CVE toolkit, I know we don't use the term CVE anymore, it was published in 2017. I was not an author on it, so I have no vested interest, but that is a tool for organizations to do their own evaluation at the outset, and throughout the course of the program, if they can't secure funding or if they can't get an outside evaluator. This is a step-by-step guide that I found to be really comprehensive and really easy to use, that actually tells organizations what they can do from step A to step Z. So that's my recommendation.
We have time for one more question if there is one. All right. We got one.
Will the tool be available?
Well, if the version for international returnees is available, if anyone wants to reach out, just reach out to me. The one for more domestic violent extremism is probably going to take another 6 months or so. And we're not trying to monetize it or control it. We want to work, but we want to work in collaboration with whoever wants to adapt it, so that at the end of the day, the data can speak to each other and be part of like a learning community that we'll build together. Thank you.
I'll just add one thing really quick. If you are thinking about the difficulties of doing assessment, you've personally been presented with a lot of different things that you could look at, from these push-pull factors, from these reintegration factors, from looking at it at the different opinions, that if you wanted to try to put together your own tool, it wouldn't be that difficult, because you have an idea of what some of the questions you would need to ask are based on the information you've been presented in this panel and earlier in the day. You maybe wouldn't do a perfect job at it, but you would be able to take a stab at doing it on your own, and it would probably be worthwhile.
We have one more question.
Sorry, it's not really a question, just building on this discussion. I fully support Sammy in that it's not that easy. It takes a lot of money to engage an academic institution to customize a tool for our very unique, localized and regional programs. And I noticed in doing my own research that also there's no assessment around bias. I mean, we work with hate crime offenders and none of them mention hate and bias, right? So go to the implicit bias associated, the IAT assessment test or something. We're not measuring their implicit bias that they don't know and we're never gonna know, which is a fun thing you can do as an activity if you want. We want to actually look at their actual bias and we want to see it change over time. There are no measures available to us on this. So just throwing that out, there's another part of our challenge in our field.
Absolutely, just the pushback would say it's probably not that expensive to interact with like an individual, like people like us who do this. I've done this with other groups, not expensive at all, to bring me in and work, help you develop a tool for my framework and what are your own needs that you would like to look, we could very easily put something together, with combining our efforts, right? So I think there are ways around that, ways to do that with limited funding and limited, all the limitations that are out there. Trying to end on a positive.
Everybody's got to email you.